Good afternoon, and thank you very much for participating in this webinar. Kathryn Coffel is a leader in applying private sector research techniques to the field of transit. She provides consulting services from the initial strategic phases through design and implementation. She brings a bachelor's degree in business, a master's in planning, and over 25 years of transit experience, working for a transit agency and as a transit consultant. Kathryn's work includes market and customer research, performance reporting, and fair policy analysis in support of transit planning. Her ability to use hard data and her keen perception allows her to see transit through the lens of the different subpopulations of current and potential transit riders. Kathryn is driven by her belief that applying solid market research principles to transit can result in service that is used and supported by everyone. Kathryn is chairman for the Transportation Research Board's Public Transportation Marketing and Fair Policy Committee. Jamie Parks has worked on a wide variety of projects in transit planning, transit performance measurement, statistical analysis, and transportation research. Jamie also participated in several guidelines development and transit research projects, including service as the Associate Investigator for TCRP Report 153, Guidelines for Providing Access to Public Transportations, as a lead researcher for TCRP Report 141, Methodology for Peer Comparison and Performance Measurement in the Transit Industry, and ongoing work on TCRP A15C, Transit Capacity and Quality of Service Manual, 3rd edition. Jamie's applied planning experience includes work with Sound Transit to evaluate the potential effectiveness of a wide range of station access improvements, work with WMATA to develop non-motorized station area access studies, and transit performance evaluations for transit agencies throughout the country. Jamie is an effective communicator and provides his clients with a well-rounded perspective based on his involvement in a wide variety and geographic diversity of projects, and serves as the chair of the TRB Bicycle Research Subcommittee. Now I will turn the presentation over to Kathryn.
Thank you very much, Judy. And thank you, everyone, for joining and attending this webinar on TCRP Report 153. As Judy mentioned, I'm Kathryn Coffel. I was the principal investigator for this project. And also Jamie Parks is here, and I'll give him a chance to say hello also.
Hi, everyone. This is Jamie.
So now you'll know when his voice pops in later on. I would like to start by acknowledging the research team. In addition to myself and Jamie Parks, there was Connor Semler from Kittleson & Associates. Herb Levinson worked with us on this, as did David Sampson from AECOM, Joe Schofer, and Carol Katch-Dorian from the Tool Design Group. Before we turn to the outline of the webinar, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the resources available through TCRP Report 153. This is a very comprehensive look at station access and access modes and resulted in 3 primary research products. The first of these is a guidebook that was printed. The guidebook has 2 sections, Part 1 and 2, which have the first part being the process and planning portions, and then Part 2 is the actual design guidelines and information on station access arrangement. The second important product that came out of this were the case studies. The case studies are very detailed, and it's about 150 pages worth of material. So as such, it's not printed in the guidebook, but is available as an appendix, Appendix E, that is available on CD-ROM with the guidebook or available for download. And the third important tool that came out of this is the Multimodal Station Access Planning Tool. That is available as Appendix C of the report, and again available for download and available in the CD-ROM. This first webinar deals primarily with the guidebook. It will be the parts 1 and 2, so the process planning, and it will also cover the station access guidelines. And I will also be covering the case studies in Appendix E. I'm going to fly through these first sessions and the first slides in the interest of time, so we can keep moving. The second webinar, which follows this one for those of you who have signed up for it, We'll be covering primarily the mode of access planning tool, which is Appendix C. It will also cover the chapters 4 and 5, which provide the basis for developing that tool and the data, and covers the station typologies that we developed as a part of that access planning tool. We will not be covering the stakeholder interviews or literature review. That's in Appendix A, and the literature review is very complete and is available as web-only document number 44. We also won't be covering Appendix B, which provides an overview of all of the existing station access tools. There's a lot of information in this report, so we are really going to be just touching on the topics in the guidebook in this first webinar and on the process. But hopefully it will give you enough background that you'll be able to pick up the report in the future and use it for your next station access planning project. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, who will talk about what is high-capacity transit, what are we talking about, with the problems associated with planning for access. Jamie.
Thank you, Kathryn. So I want to take a couple minutes just to briefly introduce the scope of the study and then the problems that we were attempting to address with the research itself. So first, with the definition of high-capacity transit, what we meant by that was essentially, one, anything that is rail. So it's basically anything that is in an exclusive right-of-way. So we've got 5 different line haul modes that were covered under the name of high-capacity transit. So commuter rail, heavy rail, and light rail, and then BRT and ferry. So the scope of the studies, we're looking at access to stations along those systems. And in terms of the access modes that we covered as part of the project, basically the 4 major access modes, walking, bicycling, feeder buses, transit, and then auto, whether park and ride or kiss and ride, all 4 of those major access modes are covered as part of the research. And then in addition, we've included transit-oriented development as sort of an access mode. It's not quite an access mode, but in the way that it's dealt with by transit agencies in the planning process, in the trade-offs that might occur between, say, investing in TOD versus investing in additional parking capacity, there are some similarities between TOD and access modes. So in the way TOD is incorporated into the guidebook, it's often treated as sort of the 5th access mode. So that tells us what it is that we're talking about in this project. But why is it that we needed to do the project at all? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? Well, first, transit stations are valuable and rare assets. And so naturally, we want to maximize the benefit that those stations have to the communities that they're in. But when we say maximize the benefit, that's a confusing term, because when you're talking about transit stations, there are a lot of different stakeholders involved. It's not just the transit agency that runs the service. It's also the local jurisdiction in which the station is located in. They may have interest in promoting economic development in their station area, or interest in promoting bicycling and walking in their community. It's the MPO who may have an interest in reducing regional congestion. Neighborhood associations may be interested in economic development. They may be interested in reducing congestion. They may be concerned about the traffic impacts of additional parking. So there are a lot of different stakeholders with a lot of different goals when it comes to access to transit stations. From the simple goals such as maximizing ridership or minimizing operating costs to attracting new development. And so when you have a lot of goals, some of them are complementary and some of them aren't. And so naturally this leads you into a planning process that has a lot of trade-offs, and where you need to have a collaborative process to deal with these issues and ultimately come up with solutions that match the local context of the stations that we're dealing with. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathryn, and she's going to walk through the planning process that we developed in the guidebook in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Jamie. As Jamie mentioned, there are a lot of stakeholders and competing expectations for the areas around the stations, and it is a significant infrastructure investment. So looking at this, we realized that we needed a process and a planning process for addressing all of the different competing needs and desires out of this. So in Chapter 2, we introduced an 8-step planning process. It was developed based on our conversations with the case study agencies and also just knowledge of basic planning processes. We're going to go through the process in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation, but I do want to emphasize that we recognized in developing the process that every station access planning activity will be different. There are going to be different circumstances, different things that are givens that are not givens, and so the process itself is not intended to be prescriptive. You may not need all of the steps in the process, and also the steps may not fall in the order that we have them put in here. So in that regard, this is an idealized process, not a prescriptive process. It does provide a good framework for decision making. The 3 principles that did come out of our case studies that help ensure a successful planning process are step 2. Step 2 is the establishing a collaborative environment. If you don't have a collaborative environment, the stakeholders are not engaged, they're not working together on the process, and they can work at cross purposes, which can inhibit coming up with a good solution. A second key principle that is important in ensuring the success of a access planning project is to use qualitative measures and quantitative measures, setting up the criteria which then the options can be judged against. This adds credence to the process by involving stakeholders in developing these criteria, and it helps remove perceptions of any one stakeholder group predetermining results. The third key principle for a successful process is performance monitoring. So after the project's been implemented, hopefully there is a data collection plan that goes out and sees how well the project met its goals, which does 2 or 3 very important things. First of all, it reports back to the stakeholders that you are achieving the goals that you set out to do, so they feel bought into the process. Second of all, it allows the agency to learn from the experience of the access planning exercise, so you can use that data in the future. And the third piece is it provides credibility with the region, so they understand that the agency is operating in good faith, and it will help smooth the path for future projects. As I mentioned, we'll be coming back to the planning process later. What we are going to turn to now are the insights that we learned from the transit agencies, which is found in Chapter 3. I'm going to touch on just briefly the categories of information that you can find in these. The case studies themselves brought forward 9 elements that were in place that led to successful station access planning, and we have those identified. We have 5 areas that were notably missing in some areas and that could inhibit the successful implementation of a planning process. So these are gaps such as data, tools, resources, and staffing skills. So those are identified in this chapter. And finally, what we've got in here are the insights from the case studies themselves, which we have summarized and then put into Chapter 3. As I mentioned, the case studies are actually part of an appendix and not in the printed report. So we put the insights and lessons learned from the case studies into Chapter 3. Next, I'd like to turn to the case studies themselves. The case studies were the primary source of information for the material in the report. We conducted detailed case studies with 11 agencies to learn how the agency approached station access planning and any policies that they had in place. We then looked at how they applied that process at the station level. So we have 11 case study agencies, and then working with the agencies, we identified 22 stations and did detailed analysis of the access planning for those stations. Overall, this is 150 pages worth of case study information, which is why it's an appendix. So I think what I'll do is just tell you what each one then covers, and we can move into a little bit of the background of the case studies. First of all, each case study has a theme that sets the context for why we talk to that agency. We have background data on the agency so you understand the context, the lessons learned, as I had mentioned in Chapter 3 and the previous slide. We then look at the process that the agency used to do their access planning, and we identify any policies that they may have in place and any tools that they use. And then finally, the example stations, where we do the background data for the station context and show how they did their access planning. I'd like to introduce the case studies by way of their themes. Hopefully we'll be able to get through this quickly. The first theme and the first agency was BART, the heavy rail system in San Francisco. They are using policy and data to drive their decisions. The MacArthur Station case study shows how they analyzed the impacts of TOD and various parking replacement scenarios on overall transit ridership. Ultimately, by using their tools and the data, they were able to justify an 85% per-person parking ratio at the station. Los Angeles Metro demonstrates experimentation and options. The North Hollywood station connects the end of the red line, which is a heavy rail line, with the BRT orange line. This connection happens at street level. So there is the people come out of the station, they need to cross a crosswalk on a busy street to get over to the BRT station. It's a heavily used connection. There are 13 connecting bus routes, 1,900 parking spaces, and a variety of bicycle parking options. Through this case study, LA Metro was able to demonstrate how the station is being redeveloped to increase safety and access for all of the modes. MATA is fostering a TOD and a parking-oriented system. MATA was developed to be a park and ride access system with any local access coming from feeder bus routes. They're finding that that is very expensive, and now they're determining that they would be better off using the land to create TOD. The Lindbergh Station case study looked at that policy decision to leverage the large amount of land and pursue transit-oriented development. MBTA in Boston is a community-driven station access management philosophy. MBTA has constrained resources, so they're not looking at station expansion, but they still want to improve access to their station. The World Trade Center station provides an example of how they worked with the community to provide access in a way that fits with the community's vision, focusing primarily on pedestrian access and on-street feeder bus access. Metro North Railroad is commuter rail that connects upstate New York with the city of New York. Their theme is providing 21st century access on a 19th century system. The system was built over 120 years ago, and so the stations today don't resemble, or the areas surrounding the stations don't resemble the same thing they did in the past. The Ossining Station case study shows how the agency was able to increase station access by working with the developer and the surrounding jurisdictions to take advantage of a ferry connection so passengers can park on the other side of the river where there is more room for park and ride, since the station itself is in a heavily developed area at this time. New Jersey Transit's theme is to work with local communities to achieve statewide goals. New Jersey Transit provides extensive commuter rail service to New York City and also within New Jersey, serving hundreds of municipalities. The state has a goal to create transit communities through a Transit Communities Initiative, creating a large TOD program within the state. New Jersey Transit is working with them to make sure that the goals and the land use around the areas support this initiative. The TOD case study on the Rahway Station is one of the first communities that was developed under the Transit Communities Initiative. OC Transpo is in Ottawa in Canada. They are our only non-U.S. example agency, and they are here because they have the largest North American BRT system. The St. Lawrence Center Station case study looked at how they were able to successfully apply the light rail design guidelines to BRT and create a transit-oriented shopping mall with fewer parking spaces and 30% of the shoppers riding on transit. The Denver case study shows how you can integrate access into another light rail system. There are two case study stations, County Line and Inglewood, which together provide opposite examples of integrating access into adjoining land use. In one case, the surrounding areas and the retail there did not support having the rail station, and they isolated themselves physically from the station. In the other case study, the jurisdiction actively pursued integrating the station into the land use and their development around the station. So a nice comparison there. Sound transit demonstrates moving from station isolation to neighborhood integration, a similar theme to what's in Denver. When they built the system in Sound Transit, they felt that they could isolate the station so that it would have no impact on the surrounding community. After 10 years, they realized that that's not the case, and so now they are shifting to move to integrating the stations into the neighborhoods. The Kent Station study is an example of that. And also as a part of their long-term station planning, we had the opportunity to apply our tool that we developed as part of this process into their station access planning process. TriMet builds consensus one community at a time. They have an extensive grassroots-based system that is probably fairly unique in the country. The Lake Road and Park Avenue stations case study is one that shows how their collaboration with the businesses in the local jurisdictions allowed them to balance the density, balance the bike access and the parking access, so that all of the concerns were addressed that were concerns of the local jurisdictions, and they were also able to reduce the costs for the project by balancing the parking and bike access. The last of our case studies is WMATA, the heavy rail system in Washington, D.C. They are focused on increasing access to meet growing demand. We used the Silver Spring case study as an example of this. Silver Spring is now in a very heavily developed area with high density, high levels of activities on all of their access modes and in the surrounding areas. So they have redeveloped their station to meet this need, including having to include 34 bus bays that serve both public and private connecting bus service. So that gives you a feel for what each of these case studies have in them. The case studies each have the theme, as I mentioned, and then after that, every case study follows with the lessons learned. So just as an example, I'm including what the lessons learned are from the MBTA in Boston. As I already mentioned, MBTA is focusing on asset management, not the expansion of their stations. And they have been able to demonstrate that even with that focus on asset management, they have been able to improve access to the stations through focusing their efforts on those who wish to work with them. Their success has been through working with the local jurisdictions and the communities that want to improve access and that are committed to the process and the outcomes. So again, that gets back to the collaborative environment. Make sure everyone's working on the same page. They do not have a formalized station access plan, and they do not have mode split targets for their stations. Even so, they have found that collecting that type of data on mode of access has helped them plan station improvements in a fiscally constrained environment. One example is that they found ridership did not decline at stations when parking fees were increased. There was lower parking demand due to the higher parking fees, but passengers switched to other access modes, thereby maintaining ridership. And then that data can be used and applied for other stations without fear of harming their ridership levels. What I want to do next is take a look at the planning process. For each of the case studies, we took a look at how they did planning at their agency, As I had mentioned earlier, not every agency uses every step of the process. So what we've done is, in this next section, take a look at the planning process and the 8 steps, and look at what each of those steps are and giving an example from the case studies of how they apply the planning process. Step 1 of the planning process is identifying the project need. This is important in order to organize agency thinking and the planning up front, to understand the issues from multiple perspectives, and to recognize external concerns. It sets the stage for all of the other steps. This is also something that the agency must be fully behind, and that can be clearly articulated to the stakeholders. For Metro North Railroad, which was built over 120 years ago, their need is that ridership is growing, and they have a very constrained environment. They need to increase access to the existing stations, yet many of these stations are in small rural towns where the neighborhoods are attempting to protect that small town atmosphere. And other stations are now in densely developed areas where increased auto access is not really possible due to a constrained network. And additional parking can exacerbate the congestion problems within the community. Metro North is also challenged in that when it was built, they were built as a rail station, so they only own the station itself, and the land around it is operated and owned by local jurisdictions or private entities. So their need is trying to expand this system by working with the local jurisdictions in a very constrained environment where they own virtually none of the adjacent land and have no control over the adjacent decision-making for the networks that attach the stations to the community. The second step of the process is establishing a collaborative environment with all of the stakeholders. This is where the agency acknowledges the interrelationships of the various stakeholder groups, establishes shared goals for the transportation, environment, economic, and other concerns with station planning, and understands the perspective of the traveler. I'd like to go back to the TriMet case study and their process, which focuses entirely on establishing this collaborative environment. It's a very intensive process and starts at the very beginning, when one staff person is assigned to each of the station or the line segments when planning a light rail line. Those people then stick with that portion of the project for the entire 8 to 10 years that it takes to go from planning through implementation. They don't contract out this work because TriMet wants full control of the staff, and they want the community to know that this is TriMet speaking and that the community can count on that person. By having the same person in this throughout, there's one person who then understands all of the deals that are made, all of the issues and concerns that have been raised throughout the project, and also the community knows this person and has a working relationship. So together they have the knowledge and the relationships to help resolve problems without having it blow up and stop the process from moving forward. There are a couple of examples of this on one project, which is the one of the Lake Road case study. TriMet actually hired an engineer through the project money to represent a small city because they did not have the engineering capability to do it. That gave TriMet the ability to have an engineer to work with. The city had an engineer to work with, and they could come up with compromises that worked for everyone. A second example is the picture that is here, where they coordinated with the NPO, the local jurisdictions, in a request from a local community college to use land that was being underutilized in the parking lots and create a community college at the transit center. And from this picture you can see there's the rail, there's the bus, and there's the building, the transit center. So it is literally at the station. The third step of the planning process are developing the objectives and the principles. So you've got a collaborative work environment, you know what you're trying to do with the project, and now you get an objective set down on paper. We need to do this to address all of the multiple stakeholder issues. It's valuable to have a set of standard access goals and objectives that can be applied throughout the system, so this stakeholder process can be used to do agency-level access planning guidelines. But it's also done at the station level as you get to each station. Denver has an example of developing their objectives and their principles. They established their initial light rail line over 20 years ago to relieve peak hour congestion. The line predominantly follows the freeway and freight corridors, and they relied heavily on park and ride access. The station access from buses is valuable in the end stations where they connect with express bus trips. As the region has developed, however, the transit-oriented development began to take hold, and they began to move away from the auto orientation and began thinking of a more balanced access plan. In 2009, they developed transit access guidelines to provide specific goals and standards for access related to pedestrians, bicycles, kiss and ride, and park and ride. The guidelines clearly identify RTD's access responsibilities of others, and what are joint responsibilities between the agency developers and a local jurisdiction. In 2010, a strategic plan for transit-oriented development was then developed that helps guide the decisions on transit-oriented development around stations. And finally, they developed a transit access committee within the agency to help with the interdisciplinary coordination. They found out that people would shop around to try and get the right answer, so the committee helps coordinate internally. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jamie, who will take you through the next steps of the planning process.
Thanks again, Kathryn. So I'm going to walk through here steps 4 through 8 of the planning process, again giving illustrative examples from the case studies for each of the steps. So step 4, once the agency has developed their objectives, it's really necessary to match those to specific evaluation criteria that can be used to carry those objectives forward through the planning process. So to the extent possible, we'd want those evaluation criteria to be objective wherever it makes sense, so that they can be easily quantified and alternatives can be easily compared. At the same time, one thing that we saw throughout the case studies was really the need for both qualitative as well as quantitative evaluation criteria to be incorporated into the process. So while ridership and costs might be easily quantified, things like economic development impacts or aesthetics or neighborhood impacts, those things are much more qualitative and yet are still very important and need to be incorporated into the evaluation criteria. With that said, of course, there are a lot of different things you would want to include in your criteria, but in order to make them useful, we would recommend having 10 or fewer evaluation criteria to make sure that they would be easily applied in practice. If you get more than that, it becomes quite difficult to apply it. So in this case, sound transit is a good example of developing specific evaluation criteria matched to their objectives. And in this case, the Board of Directors established a set of 10 evaluation criteria for all of their capital planning, some of which are very related to access planning specifically, and others of which are more tangential. And they range from what you'd expect in terms of maximizing ridership and limiting capital and operating costs, but also included in the evaluation criteria explicitly are system integration, making sure you're integrating stations into adjacent transportation networks, enhancing opportunities for TOD, and improving connectivity. So through those 10 evaluation criteria, that's something that Sound Transit has applied to their access planning process, including through a recent flexible access study for their commuter rail system that wanted to look at cost-effective ways to increase ridership, not just looking at park and ride expansion, but looking at park and ride expansion as well as other improvements that might improve ridership. And these evaluation criteria were very useful for that study. Step 5 is, as you're looking at the alternatives that you want to develop, is really to make sure that what we've called build a rich set of appropriate options. So what we're trying to get at here is the idea of looking at a lot of different options to make sure that you are preserving flexibility as a transit agency for matching local context. So in this case, we've highlighted LA Metro, which is a really good example, I think, of this because they operate 4 different line haul transit modes. They serve a very large urban area with almost 90 municipalities. It's very, very diverse, but there's a need for flexibility and a lot of different solutions within their system. So, for instance, they have developed agency-wide parking policies and joint development guidelines, but those policies and guidelines preserve a lot of flexibility for staff to develop solutions at individual stations. And in fact, the joint development guidelines suggest that the agency needs to develop specific guidelines for individual sites. So they provide an overall framework, but preserve a lot of flexibility and allow the agency to look at a lot of different options, such as parking pricing, different types of replacement parking, different ways of funding joint development. Similarly, with bicycle access to the LA Metro system, bicycle ridership has been increasing consistently over the past decade, and so they're looking for ways to accommodate that without overburdening the system with bicycles on board. And so that means looking at different options in terms of bicycle storage at stations, racks, lockers. They've tested out self-serve bike stations, regular bike stations, so looking at a lot of different options. And then at the same time, when their bicyclist survey showed that the reason that a lot of cyclists bring their bikes on board is that they need the bike on both ends of their transit trip. You know, the system has been looking at ways to encourage the use of folding bikes on the system. So looking at a lot of different options there and to try to find solutions that work. Step 6 of the process is really once you have your evaluation criteria and you have a lot of different options, of course, you want to be able to evaluate them and figure out how well your alternatives work and ultimately choose one that works. And so step 6 is predicting the outcomes and applying your criteria. And in this case, we've highlighted BART out of the case studies for step 6 due to their use of several different quantitative tools that help them apply their evaluation criteria quantitatively to their planning process. In particular, there are 2 tools that BART uses that are related to access planning. One is a TOD and parking trade-offs tool, spreadsheet-based, was formed the basis of a lot of the spreadsheet tool development that we'll be covering in the second part of this webinar. In any case, that TOD tool is used to assess the impacts to BART of ridership and costs based on different development scenarios and different parking replacement scenarios. BART has also developed a direct ridership model, as they call it, which uses linear regression models based on a lot of different factors to estimate mode-specific station access. So depending on the factors input into the model, it would give you the number of feeder transit trips versus park and ride trips versus walking and biking trips. Step 7 of the process is, of course, we've applied our evaluation criteria through an objective tool, and one would think that ideally it would all come out and the answer would be obvious, but of course, in reality, that's never the case. And so even after all of this work has been done, there's still the need to go through a process of trade-offs and ultimately choosing. That's never going to be a purely quantitative exercise. And as we mentioned before, there are a lot of different stakeholders that need to be engaged in making the choices and incorporating whatever analysis you've done into ultimately getting projects funded and implemented. So in this case, we've selected WMATA as an example agency that has done a lot of work incorporating the results of their analysis and planning work into their capital program. So they have system-wide access guidelines and bicycle and pedestrian facility plan that provides the policy framework and then the analysis necessary to identify specific access improvements throughout their system. And then they've been working hard to incorporate that analysis into their capital programming. And right now they're in the process of developing and formalizing a system for evaluating the cost effectiveness of access mode improvements. And then finally, Step 8 is evaluation and monitoring. This is something that we really wanted to highlight as part of the guidebook, and something that we found important, of course, is that once something has been implemented, is monitoring it to see how well it works, and ultimately being able to use the information gained to improve future decision making. So in this case, we've highlighted New Jersey Transit for the work that they've done in evaluation and monitoring. And in particular, there are two different areas that New Jersey Transit has worked on for their program evaluation and data monitoring. So one is they do have rider surveys that provide station-specific access mode splits, dating back in some cases to the 60s, but having been done every 7 or 8 years since the early 80s. And so those rider surveys provide a really great source of longitudinal data on how station access patterns and overall ridership have changed station by station throughout the system over the last 30 years. Another area which New Jersey Transit has worked with the New Jersey DOT is in monitoring their Transit Village initiative. So they've partnered with Rutgers, who provides analysis and evaluations of this Transit Village initiative, which is intended to promote TOD. And so that evaluation allows them to understand how well the program is working, if the incentives are actually causing additional TOD to occur, and monitoring building permit activity and so on. And this being done by an objective third party. So with that concludes the 8-step process. So I want to bring it back to Kathryn, who is going to talk a bit about part 2 of the guidebook itself, focused on station design.
Thanks, Jamie. So this is going to be an exceedingly abbreviated version. I just want you to know what's out there in the book, and then you can see it for yourself. Chapter 6 has general station access guidelines, things that apply across stations, and it should be kept in mind overall when designing station access. Chapter 7 looks at pedestrian access and recognizes that all stations, even some of the most inaccessible seeming stations, should have pedestrian access, because in the end, everyone must get to the station by foot. All stations will have people who will walk regardless of their safety. In bicycle access, there is a depth of information on the ways of storing bicycles, about access to the station via bicycles, and it includes both onboard bicycle storage and at the station storage. In the transit access section, there is very detailed data on every aspect of transit access, from how the bus bays are laid out, whether it's on street or off street, terminal access and how buses circulate. There's also references in here to other materials that will be very useful, such as the Transit Capacity and Quality of Service Manual, which is currently being updated to the 3rd edition. The section on automobile access looks at why you need automobile access, and it looks at both park and ride, it looks at kiss and ride and how you lay that out within the station, how your pedestrians are circulated. It also looks at the types of parking facilities, from garage, levels of garage, to surface, to even underground parking arrangements, which is done frequently in dense areas such as Los Angeles. And the last chapter is on transit-oriented development, as Jamie had mentioned. At the beginning, it's not necessarily an access mode, but it is treated as an access mode because it does impact the station area. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over for the questions. I apologize for the briefness on the access guidelines, but I wanted to give everyone a chance to ask some questions, either on the guidebook, parts 1. If you do have specific questions you'd like us to address on part 2, we can do that. And I would like to thank everyone and turn it over to questions.
Hi, we had a webinar chat question. What are examples of asset management versus expansion?
In the example of an expansion, would be where they're looking at increasing the amount of parking, for instance, that they have at a station, perhaps moving it into a multi-floor garage or just adding more spaces. And for asset management, what they're doing is maintaining their existing facilities without expanding them at all, but putting the money into maintenance, and then looking at expansion that or changes that don't necessarily impact their ability to maintain things in the future. So they would be looking at pedestrian access modes, bicycle storage facilities, those types of things.
Yeah, I think another thing that would certainly fall in the range of asset management would be parking pricing and parking management. So if you can't afford to build new parking, making sure that you're managing your existing parking as efficiently as possible. And then possibly even some of the revenue that might come from that, as Kathryn mentioned, might even be able to put into some of those low-cost access improvements for non-auto modes if you have very constrained parking and you're unable to build additional parking.
Okay, the next question from webinar chat. I noticed some facilities have moderate grades to sidewalks and foot travel paths. Are these most likely ADA compliant?
On those, this document does not go into much depth on ADA compliance. However, in the pedestrian section of the guidelines, it will talk about that and point you to other tools that deal with accessibility. Clearly, all stations need to be accessible to all persons with disabilities, elderly. The specifics to ADA compliance, however, are not being covered in this document.
Okay, there's another webinar chat question. Are there examples of suburban stations that were designed to accommodate feeder bus routes where the majority of rides come from feeder bus routes?
There are certainly some examples of suburban stations that focus more on feeder bus service than on parking. I think one that definitely comes to mind, and maybe it's not suburban quite, but it is an end-of-the-line station, would be 95th and Dan Ryan at the end of the Red Line in the CTA in Chicago, where it has, I think, about 10,000 boardings a day that come from feeder transit access, but no parking there. I think that's probably an atypical situation, but there are a lot of situations where you might have a combined suburban transit center that has some parking available, but also 10 or 15 bus routes, and the access is pretty evenly split between parking and feeder transit, and that's something that occurs pretty frequently. And there is actually, I should point out, there is a lot of data in the guidebook if you are interested in data tables about how much ridership different stations are getting from different modes. That's in an appendix, and there's a lot of data on that.
Yes. Did you find any entities that utilize intelligent transportation systems, whether through their NPOs or their DOTs? And then also, I'm kind of curious, LA Metro just opened up their expo line. Do you know if they went ahead and incorporated any more of the process steps? It's a two-part question, by the way.
I believe on the ITS, if I heard your question correctly, we didn't see a lot of use of ITS. One example of ITS that is used is signs that tell people if the parking ride lot is full or how many spaces are still available that are being put out on the freeway. So I don't believe we have any case studies with that, but we have seen that as an example.
Another ITS example, it's pretty simple from an ITS perspective, but very important from the passenger perspective, is fare integration between feeder transit services and the line haul services that are operated by different transit agencies. So if you have a single smart card that allows the passenger to pay for the bus and then the rail, that's a pretty simple ITS application that has a lot of benefits for the riders. The second part, with respect to the EXPO line, I personally am not aware of whether LA Metro explicitly incorporated, the 8-step process into their planning for the EXPO line. The guidebook itself wasn't published at the time, so I'm guessing they didn't reference that, but they probably followed a similar process overall.
There's a question, have there been any examples of circulator systems employed to increase access?
Yes, there are a couple, and there's two ways to look at this. One is by the transit agency that is running the line haul system. In that case, we found an example at the Puyallup station for Sound Transit, where they were using a shuttle service to get people to a remote parking lot. So far it hadn't caught on, but it was fairly new service. And the other way that we see a lot of usage are private providers, other universities, business districts, and employers who run their own shuttles from the station to get to the place of employment or to the business district. And that is becoming a growing concern for many stations that are now becoming inundated with all of these private circulator services that are increasing access and use of the station, but for which the station was not designed.
Okay, in the case of New Jersey Transit, are mode split surveys collected by observation or by a survey instrument? Now, Tom Marchwinski said they use survey instruments on board our services. I don't know if you want to add more to it, Kathryn or Jamie.
That's correct. I think we can say that's correct. They use surveys.
Okay, and then the next question, do the guidelines get specific about the number and dimensions of stairways, escalators, elevators, walk paths to accommodate capacity of the system?
The guidelines themselves, and this report is primarily concerned with access to the station as opposed to access within the station. So there is a little bit of information about some of those topics within the station, but predominantly that type of information is already provided through the Transit Capacity and Quality of Service Manual, which is TCRP Report 100. That report is out of print since they're going to a third edition, but it is available online.
Next question, are there examples, guidelines of how transit agencies have worked with surrounding jurisdictions successfully at providing bicycle pedestrian access to the train facility?
Yes, definitely, and I think some of those are captured in the case studies in the guidebook. I think one good example, and there a number out there, would be LA Metro, which had a system-wide bicycle access plan which identified bicycle transit hubs throughout the region. And then the agency has worked to develop station-specific bicycle access plans and then encourage local jurisdictions to develop bicycle access plans as well. I think other systems that have done a lot of bicycle and pedestrian planning include BART and WMATA and Sound Transit. I think all of those are covered in the case studies, and they all involve working with the local jurisdictions. I think for bicycle and pedestrian access, the only way to get it done is working with the local jurisdictions because they're the ones that would ultimately implement and most of the time would fund the improvements themselves.
I would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. Thank you to Kathryn and Jamie for an informative presentation.